In the middle of the 20th century, philosophy had come close to a dead end. Philosophers had largely given up on the big questions, the meaning of existence, the purpose of human life, good and evil. Instead, they were engaged in ever smaller and more technical debates.
Philosophy in the 40s and 50s was still in the grips of this view called logical positivism. And basically, they were trying to make philosophy a lot smaller. Basically trying to make philosophy a branch of the sciences. And if you couldn't verify a claim the same way you'd verify a scientific hypothesis, then they wanted to say it was meaningless.
It was an extremely secular ethos or atmosphere. Science, for them, was at the center of the philosophical curriculum. So philosophy of science was the big thing.
On the question of the existence of God, philosophers despaired of making progress. In fact, a host of young philosophers concluded that philosophy had little worth saying about God.
When I was in graduate school, you would hear these stories about what was happening in the 1950s in this small college in Michigan called Calvin College. You would hear stories about this imposing, impressive teacher named Harry Jellema, who taught really serious philosophy from an unapologetically religious perspective.
Jellema wanted us to look behind the details to the vision at work, the understanding of God, humanity, the good, the bad, the right, the wrong.
Students flocked to him, and one of these students was a young transfer from Harvard named Alvin Plantinga. In his class was also Nick Wolterstorff, and both of them learned from Jellema how to be philosophers and how to also be people that had religious commitments at the same time. As a consequence, both of them went on to further work in philosophy. Nick went to Harvard, Al went to Michigan, and then on to Yale. He started to write papers and books like God in Other Minds or God, Freedom, and Evil. These books tackled perennial objections to speaking philosophically about God.
He was very much a grower, so these concepts that the positivists thought were ridiculous, God, possibility, necessity, essence. He comes on the scene and says, look, these actually do make sense. They're really useful. We can make discoveries. We can make really interesting, sophisticated arguments using these concepts.
So to just go ahead and write a book about God and human beings, human minds, was an extraordinarily bold move. It was a sort of in-your-face move.
Other philosophers started to notice, and they started to object.
The opponents could not attack it on the ground of competence. He knew the ins and outs of the field, so he was not going to get bested by opponents.
But Al really wasn't in the business of trying to prove that God existed. He simply tackled profound philosophical questions, like how do we know anything at all? How is it that we form proper judgments about the world? And he showed that you could make real progress if you were willing to bring God back into the picture.
Al taught to be bold, to say, maybe a part of what you think is true because of your religious background. Okay, well, start there. People who are atheist, naturalistic philosophers, how do they do their work? They take for granted their assumptions. They don't try to convert Christians to their atheistic views before they go on to defend them. They just take them for granted. And they go from there and try to work out their worldview. That's what Christians should do, Plantinga is saying.
The momentum continues to this day.
Philosophy is often seen, I think, as a competitive endeavor where one person wins by knocking holes in another person's arguments or by criticizing. And one of the gifts that Plantinga and others have given to the field of philosophy is to see it as a mutual project. We're trying to not win, but to understand better. And this has shaped at least 2 generations of philosophers.
The Society of Christian Philosophers is now the largest single group within the American Philosophical Association. There's a whole generation of younger philosophers who bring faith to bear on their work, and their influence is not just in the Western or Christian world,
Plantinga has very brilliant role in philosophy of religion.
In many ways, I think he's boldly gone when no one gone before him.
And I don't think there could have been the philosophy of religion that we see today without Alvin Plantinga.
But I think that his greater legacy is possibly still yet to come.
Al is reluctant to take credit for all of this, but for those who know him and his work, his significance has been remarkable.
Even though religious belief is still a minority in the field, philosophers of religion now don't have anything to be ashamed of and can address those sorts of religious concerns and issues with a renewed sense of mission and vigor.
You get to have a voice in this debate, and philosophy doesn't have to be dictated by one religious outlook. It's kind of a license to wonder about the questions that really engage them and their tradition.